exist accounts of the appearance of the Virgin Mary in different parts of the world. But from 1830 onwards, beginning with the apparition of Rue de Bac, reports of her appearances become more frequent and regular, and are characterized by the revelation of grave messages and requests for prayer in order to enable mankind to return to God. But the apparitions do not just consist of dark and frightening revelations, for there is a thread of love that winds its way through them all and binds all those who respond to the call. And sometimes, as mothers do, after having warned their children of the consequences of their foolish ways, the Virgin appears only to assure her children of a mother's abiding comfort and protection. Such was the theme of Lourdes and the apparitions of Pontmain, Beauraing, and Banot. Somewhere between Normandy and Brittany in the northwest of France, approximately 4 hours' drive from Paris and 45 minutes away from the famed tourist spot of Mont Saint-Michel, is the tiny village of Pontmain. Quite obviously, it is not for the city-bred or the sophisticated, and there seems to be nothing special about this village, unless one is impressed with endless fields of corn and sunflowers, or picturesque homes on an otherwise undisturbed terrain. And yet, for all its simplicity, Pontmain is visited by thousands of pilgrims and curiosity seekers from all over France and Europe. Pontmain's narrative began in the turbulent 1800s. It was an era when an intellectual ferment had swept the whole of Europe, with France serving as a major outpost for radical thought. The materialistic worldview was gaining currency among prominent intellectuals and infecting much of the populace. Faith was stripped of its mysticism and allowed to stand before the scalpel of rational thought. Rationalism advanced at the expense of faith. As insignificant as it was, this little village had not been spared from the onslaught of the so-called scientific thinking. The church had ceased to be a sanctuary for tired spirits. Its neglected and forlorn state mirrored the decline of the faithful. Into this had come a holy and energetic priest, Father Michel Guérin. For 35 years he worked to renew his parish. Alongside those who held onto the faith, he labored to rebuild the rundown chapel and had himself repainted the ceiling a royal blue, dotted with stars. In time, he succeeded in turning them into a prayerful community. But he would still implore heaven for a sign that God was watching over his village. Little did he know that the sign he prayed for would soon come and be remembered by all who had looked for divine intercession. France had declared war on its historical nemesis, Prussia, then led by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. But by the onset of 1871, it had become clear that France was no match for the Prussians' superior force and firepower. Paris had been overrun. In the countryside, residents had begun to hide their possessions. Typhoid had broken out in several towns, and smallpox was spreading. Defection and surrender to the enemy became a common occurrence. Troop morale was low, and the Prussian army was steadily advancing toward western France. On the 11th of January, an explosion of energy lit up the entire sky. Scientists claimed it was an aurora borealis, the northern lights. The faithful called it a sign from heaven. The residents of Pontmain had reason for concern. 38 young men of the village had answered the call of duty. But little did they know that on the 17th of January 1871, that Prussian troops had reached Naval, a town only 50 kilometers from their village. At around 5:30 of that afternoon, Monsieur César Barbadette and his sons Eugene, age 12, and Joseph, 10, were working in their barn pounding nettles into horse feed. A neighbor, Jean de Tay, arrived with news of the conflict. Eugene walked to the door of the barn, and as he looked out across the street, something caught his attention. About 20 feet above the Guidicock residence was a lovely lady floating in the air. Her hands were outstretched in a gesture of welcome. She was smiling at Eugene and seemed to be very happy at the sight of him. She was clad in a dark blue tunic adorned with golden stars. Wide sleeves enhanced her welcome gesture, and her garment had no belt, but fell straight down to her gold-buckled blue slippers. Around her pale, delicate features was a black veil that reached down her back to the waist and covered 2/3 of her forehead, hiding her ears and her hair. On her head was a gold crown, divided by a band of red. Completely captivated by the sight, Eugene's remarks caught his brother's attention, and soon both boys were joyfully exclaiming over the apparition. But their father couldn't see a thing, and angrily ordered them back to work. However, soon afterwards he relented and sent Eugene to fetch their mother, who also saw nothing out of the ordinary. The neighbors began to take notice, and after shutting his family in the barn to pray, he ordered his sons home for supper. The boys sadly followed, still looking at the vision, who encouraged them to obey. After supper, Madame Barbadette went to fetch Sister Vitaline, who went to school and brought 3 other children back with her. 2 of them, 11-year-old Françoise Richer and 9-year-old Jean-Marie Lebosset, confirmed the apparition. Then, Madame Fritot arrived with her terminally ill grandson, and so did the shoemaker's wife with her 25-month-old baby in her arms. Both these children gazed upwards with joy, and the baby clapped her hands, lisping the only religious name she knew, that of Jesus. By now, the whole village was rushing to the barn, including the dumbfounded Father Guérin. Then the children called out and began to describe the changes that occurred. First, an oval frame of blue surrounded the vision. 4 candles appeared, 2 at the shoulders, 2 at the knees. Then a small red cross, the size of a finger, appeared over the lady's heart. The crowd began to comment loudly, some in faith, others skeptically. The children reported that a look of sadness had fallen over the lady's face. Father Guérin silenced the crowd, and rejecting the proposal that the children speak to the lady, requested them instead to pray. As they said the rosary, the lady doubled in size and became more beautiful. The vision grew more vivid and seemed to come nearer as the stars moved further out and placed themselves at her feet. And the dark blue of her dress lightened, for the stars that adorned it multiplied, in the words of the children, like a swarm of ants. As they began the Magnificat, the most significant phase of the apparitions began. Along the length of the building, between the roof and the feet of the vision, from one chimney to the other, unfolded what seemed to be a white streamer. Vertical strokes appeared, and words slowly began to form in golden capital letters. As the children spelled out the message, the crowd stopped chanting to listen. The children were then separated so as not to overhear and influence each other. For 10 minutes, the word "mais" stood alone. So the crowd resumed their prayer, and as the Magnificat ended, a phrase had been formed. "Mais priez, mes enfants," but pray, my children. Trying to catch the children in a mistake, the crowd made them repeat this phrase over and over. Soon the doubters ceased to scoff. Some were beginning to cry. It was 7:30, and the vision had lasted over an hour. The crowd began to settle down in earnest prayer, and as they began the litany of the Blessed Virgin, more letters followed. "Du veau exaucera en peu de temps." God will help you in a little while. The promise filled the villagers with such joy, and the children gleefully called out that even the lady was laughing. At the end of the streamer, a period as big as the sun signified the end of the sentence. At this point, Monsieur Avis, the carpenter, appeared with Auguste, his 4-year-old son. The boy quietly began to describe a lovely lady in a blue dress with stars. When his father remarked that he didn't even know what blue was, the boy remarked that it was like the ceiling in the church, or his Sunday coat with sleeves. However, the carpenter stopped his son from saying anything more, hurriedly brought him home, and imposed strict instructions of silence on his entire family. This secret was revealed only half a century later, when then Jesuit lay brother Auguste Avis lay dying and confessed that he had indeed seen the Virgin. The crowd started a new canticle. Letters began to appear on the second line. As the words "Mon Fils" were formed, the crowd exclaimed that it was indeed the Blessed Mother. And in the Salve Regina that followed, the sentence was completed. Mon fils se laisse toucher. My son allows himself to be touched. A line of golden light underlined this second part of the message. But pray, my children, God will help you in a little while. My son allows himself to be touched. They began to sing the hymn of the sanctuary of Our Lady of Hope. The Virgin raised her hands and laughingly moved her fingers in time to the music. The inscription remained for a time, and then a scroll, the color of the sky, seemed to pass over the words and cover them up. As they sang a hymn to Jesus, the lady was seen to pronounce the words together with them. She then appeared downcast, and a large red cross bearing a crucified Christ of the same color appeared in her hands. She tilted it toward the children so that they could see it fully. At the top, as long as the cross piece, against a background of white, and in red capital letters, were the words, Jesus Christ. She seemed to be looking at the cross with such deep sorrow that Joseph Barbadette would remember that moment all his life. New movement ushered in the final stages of the vision. From beneath the oval, a star moved up, lit the candles one by one, and took a position directly above it. The crowd continued to pray fervently. The red crucifix disappeared, and the lady resumed her original position with arms extended towards the crowd. On each shoulder, a small white cross the size of a hand appeared. By 8:30 p.m., they began to say their evening prayers, and as they reached the examination of conscience, a large white veil was seen at the Virgin's feet. It slowly hid her from view as it rose, and as her body vanished from sight, so too the stars disappeared on the horizon. The veil stopped short at the base of the crown, which remained visible and disappeared without being covered up. Then the star above the head, the blue circle, and the candles vanished as well. It was almost 9 o'clock. The villagers went home at peace with themselves and the world around them. The Prussian forces never reached Pontmain. For unexplainable reasons, they turned back and withdrew without fighting. Paris surrendered on the 28th of January, and 4 days later an armistice was signed. France had lost the war and had to pay a heavy indemnity, but the bloodshed had ended, and peace came. Only 15 days after the Lady of Pontmain had given her message of hope. The 38 soldiers conscripted from this little village all returned unwounded. The inquiry began the day after the apparition. The Dean of Landivy arrived and, skeptical about the events, began to question the visionaries separately. He left, convinced that they were telling the truth. Several other investigations followed. Special commissions were formed, and each tried to trap the children into contradicting one another. But all remained unshakable. After lengthy examinations, a panel of 3 doctors ruled out hallucination and other neurotic causes. In just a little over a year, the Bishop of Laval, Monsignor Wicca, gave his decision. The judgment was based upon a long line of reasoning that despite initial disbelief, the event had won unanimous acceptance, had produced graces, conversions, and numerous cures. And in addition to this, the witness of the children was irreproachable, both in what they saw as well as in their behavior. One after another, he ruled out possibilities of fraud, hallucination, suggestibility, and demonic influence. So he judged that the Immaculate Virgin Mary, Mother of God, truly appeared on the 17th of January to Eugène Barbadette, Joseph Barbadette, François Richet, and Jean-Marie Le Bosset in the hamlet of Pontmain. request for prayer had not gone unheeded. As word spread, crowds began to flock to the village. Pilgrims came, many on foot, to visit the spot where the Virgin had appeared, and their witness brought further crowds. Conversions and healings multiplied, and the parish church soon became too small to accommodate those who came to pray. Due to the spontaneous generosity of the early pilgrims, work on a basilica soon began. The visionaries tried to live their lives in humble service of the church and their fellow man. The Barbadette brothers became priests. Eugene was curate, then parish priest in the Diocese of Laval. He lived until 1927. Joseph, who died in 1930, became an oblate of Mary Immaculate, the order which had taken charge of the shrine. Françoise Richer became a teacher, and later, priest housekeeper to Eugene. Both Eugene and Joseph were with her when she died in 1915. Jean-Marie Lebosset entered the religious order of Sisters of the Holy Family and died in Bordeaux in 1933. However, of them all, she had suffered the most. For 2 years she was firm in her witness of the vision, even when, in order to test her truthfulness, a famous general drew his sword and pushed its point against her body. But incidents such as these caused the child to suffer from stress, and after she had taken her oath, she started to be tormented by scruples. Her memory faltered, and she began to believe that she had lied. And so she made her official retraction in December 1920. Examinations, though, have shown her original witness faultless, clear, coherent, direct, joyful, and spontaneous. On the other hand, the retraction is incoherent, contradictory, leading investigators to believe that she had suffered from a psychological crisis. And though she didn't retain the honor of being a visionary of Mary, she believed in the grace of Pontmain on the testimony of others and lived by it to the very end. Others have tried to do the same, as has Father Jean Rivant, who as parish priest of Pontmain for the past 6 years, presides not only over his parishioners, but also over the multitudes who flock to the village every year.
The real message of Pontmain is an invitation to prayer.
That Mary rose to heaven, but she continues to be attentive to her son's brothers and sisters, her children who continue their pilgrimage, trials or battles here on earth. Now there was a time when the village was desperate and discouraged. Mary came with a mist before the eyes of her children, who were at war, and she said that she was mindful of the things dividing them, and she came to bring peace.
Why did she appear here in the color of dark blue?
That is Our Lady's secret, why she manifested herself thus to the children. But reflecting on this, we note that Mary wanted to beatify the ministry of our provincial parish priest. She was grateful for his having restored this church, with a ceiling in blue, with the color of the workers' wagon cart, and with golden stars. And Mary took on those working clothes without any belt and followed the colors of the church ceiling. The red crucifix is the center of the manifestation at Pontmain. Mary offers to a discouraged population the source of faith and of hope, which is Jesus Christ crucified. It is the most beautiful manifestation of God's love. It is read because Jesus has saved us from our sins, from death, by offering us his blood. He had nailed to the cross the edict of death that mitigates or saves all the faithful. Mary is the teacher of the Paschal mystery, and she reveals to us that the crucified one is Jesus Christ.
Father Ivan, who was consecrated to Mary in 1947, goes on to comment on her character in this apparition.
At Pontmain, Mary presented herself as a school mistress, a teacher, and she wrote on the blackboard the things that were important. She wanted to remind us of the passages, the Acts of the Apostles. There is no other name that was given to mankind by which he can be saved. Mary is a mother who watches over her children and keeps them company. From her smile and gestures, she supports them in praise and acclamation. During the apparition, she was very lively and a teacher of prayer. It is often a prayer of praise and acclamation, a prayer of intercession, or a penitential prayer. Mary is adapted to all the events of history. She is not temporary, and in the glory of the Father, she communicates the suffering of her children.
In Pontmain today, the center of activity is the Basilica, an edifice which measures up to the attention lavished upon this rather obscure village. Erected in the vicinity of the apparition site, it can be seen from afar, rising magnificently over rooftops, fields, and flowers. Even more breathtaking are its stained glass windows, which bathe the congregation in brilliant colors as light filters through scenes of the life of Christ or other apparitions of His Blessed Mother. The old church is still in existence, its pews and interiors maintained, with murals depicting the sequence of events situated directly overhead on Father Guérin's blue ceiling spangled with stars. Masses are said daily in both churches, and the community singing that accompanies all the services are led by the nuns, reminiscent perhaps of the manner in which the lady had joyfully conducted the hymn on that memorable night. The barn has now become an oratory, and displayed within are the tools used by the Barbadette family. Anchored on the walls are life-size statues that also portray the various stages of the apparition. The Guidecoq residence has been turned into an inn and a souvenir shop. On its roof is a small statue of the Virgin and an inscription commemorating the event. The street where the rectory was once located has now been named after Father Guérin, an affirmation of the villagers' affection and respect. The room he lived in is now a meeting and study area for catechists, but his books have been carefully preserved and are still on the shelves, giving one an insight into the character of the man. Aside from a small hotel and a few inns, there is a pilgrim's hostel located across the street from the Basilica. It is run by the religious in charge of the shrine, and for a very modest fee, one is treated to comfortable rooms, clean baths, and hearty meals accompanied by homegrown fresh fruits and wine and cheese of the region. The village has kept its charm, but people come for other reasons. Some out of curiosity, some to reaffirm their faith, others to seek solace and hope for the grace of a physical or spiritual healing, and still others merely to gain respite from a harried and materialistic world. And those who have come and prayed have not been rebuffed, but rather found new hope.
One comes to Pontmain when one does not know anymore what to do. When he believes that one wants a divorce, one asks the Blessed Virgin to find the way of unity. And I can tell you that there was 3 years ago a man who came because his wife left him. He walked 200 kilometers to come. And the first person he met in Pontmain was his wife, who had abandoned him. There are many events of that kind. My predecessors say that Mary, who came to Pontmain, has not left. At the end of the apparition, she has not flown. And I verify that Mary is present. And all of the pilgrims who come to Pontmain come because they know they will meet their mother here.
An interesting sidelight has to do with the wording of the message. On the days that followed the apparition, an objection arose over the Virgin's use of the word "but" in the first phrase. It was brought out that a message could not begin with this conjunction as it implied a previous phrase, and that it was a grammatical fault, casting doubt on the children's ability to read the message correctly. It was Jean-Marie who pointed out that whenever their teachers or mothers were fed up, they often began their reproaches with that word, as Sister Vitaline would, when she would say, "But you should be studying, but you should be studying." And so then the doubters no longer dared to laugh. Of all the manifestations that occurred within this apparition, some stand out so powerfully. The phrase, "My son allows himself to be touched," has also been loosely translated into "My son is willing to hear you" or "My son permits himself to be moved." But the original interpretation calls to mind the passage from the New Testament account of Luke, chapter 8, verses 43 to 48, about a woman who had suffered for 12 years from a hemorrhage and had, in the midst of a crowd that almost crushed Jesus, reached out, touched the hem of his garment, and was healed. For despite all the movement around him, this woman's seemingly imperceptible touch and faith had caused the power to go forth from Jesus, and he recognized someone's need. Had the Virgin observed that men were beginning to forget to reach out in faith for Jesus and wanted to reassure them that he continued to be sensitive to every need? In Pontmain, she continues to show mankind her son. And could the crosses on her heart, in her hand, and on her shoulder be interpreted to mean that one should, as Jesus did in taking up his cross, obey the will of the Father? And the actuality of the power of prayer seemed to be manifested that evening. For when the villagers began to pray, the message started to unfold. As they stopped chanting in order to listen and comment on the children's remarks, the formation of the letters also came to a halt. And only when they resumed the Magnificat were the other letters disclosed. Realizing this, they began to sing and pray again. Another interesting characteristic of Mary's apparition in Pontmain is a very visible display of her human nature. The children's description of her laughter at the villagers' reactions, her sorrow upon focusing on the cross, and her pleasure in conducting the singing seems to point out that she does exist at one and the same time with those she chooses to visit throughout the centuries, that another reality exists alongside of this one, and that while this life is temporary, the other is eternal. The villagers of Pontmain believe that Mary never left them, that she didn't disappear but was only hidden from view. Could that also be the implication of this apparition? That the kingdom of God is always at hand, and that only through prayer will the heavens open up and the message unfold?
You have just seen the woman clothed with the sun.